Good afternoon. I'm Mark Greenfield, and as chairman of the Associated Student Speakers Program, I'd like to welcome you to another program in our noon lecture series. Today's guest, a Stanford professor and authority on ecology, is the author of The Population Bomb, which presents the present and future problems of overpopulation. Professor Ehrlich has warned, for example, that there will be a worldwide famine in 5 years if nothing is done to halt the population explosion. And it is such ominous predictions that prompted us to invite him here today. It is with pleasure that I introduce to you Professor Paul Ehrlich.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to come to a beautiful spot like Los Angeles. The aesthetic grandeur of it brought tears to my eyes the minute I stepped out of the airplane. I almost canceled out because, after all, as you all know, President Nixon now has things completely under control after his magnificent speech giving us the State of the Nation. We're going to have a $500 billion increase in the gross national product, and half of the people of Los Angeles are going to be resettled in Nevada somewhere, as I understand it. Well, I suspect most of you know we're in tough shape. For the benefit of those of you who don't, let me give you a very brief review of the population situation for a starter. We got into our present trouble about 10,000 years ago when we took up agriculture, made life a little more secure for ourselves, and started to depress the death rate in the human population. That time there were about 5 million people. It took about almost that full 10,000 years till about 1650 to run that 5 million up to 500 million or half a billion. And that meant a doubling every 1,000 or 1,500 years. We did that mostly through improvements in our agriculture. Then we kept improving our agriculture in between 1650 and 1850. With the start of the Industrial Revolution, we managed to run a half a billion into a billion people. Then we had the end of the Industrial Revolution and the Biomedical Revolution. It just took 80 years instead of 200 to double the next time to 2 billion people. And if we're very, very lucky, we may continue to grow to reach 4 billion around 1975, a 45-year period to double the population there. If you think of man's evolutionary history as stretching back over perhaps 4 million years, that means that it took us 99.99999% of the history of our species to get the first 2 billion people, and 0.0000001% of the history of our species to get the second 2 billion people to go up to 4 billion. Now, it's very difficult to come to grips with growth rates which give you, for instance, at the moment, an instantaneous rate of increase of almost 2%, 1.9%, in a doubling time of 37 years. It means that we're adding 70 million people to the planet annually. That is, every 3 years we've got to do something with the equivalent of the population of the United States. Excuse me. Perhaps more dramatically, you can think that in all the wars the United States has fought, we have had 600,000 battle deaths. That's revolution all the way through Vietnam, roughly 600,000 battle deaths. Now, I'm a little bit dazed, but I think today is Wednesday, isn't it? That means that world population growth has made up that number since about Sunday noon. I'll give you some measure of the role war can play in population control. All right, we have a population that is growing at fundamentally a ridiculous rate. When I say that the population of the world is doubling every 37 years at the current moment, that is really a compound rate. It's made up of two different kinds of doubling times. The kind that you find in the overdeveloped countries, like the United States, the Soviet Union, and Japan, where population is skyrocketing, where you have a doubling time of about 65 years, a growth rate which is resulting in a continual depression of the standard of living in all those countries. The only context in which that kind of growth rate could be considered slow, because of course if you project it a few hundred years in the future, it gives you disaster on any scale. The only way it could be considered slow is if you compare it with growth rates in the never-to-be-developed countries like Honduras and Indonesia and so on, where countries are often doubling their population size in 20 years. Now, just think for a minute what it means for a country to double its population size in 20 years. It means that in order to maintain today's standard of misery, everything in that country for the support of human beings is going to have to be duplicated in 20 years. That means you're going to have 2 homes where you have one today, 2 physicians where you have one today, twice the agricultural production, twice the imports, twice the exports, twice the road network, and so on and so forth. The United States has been unable to keep up with its population growth and build sufficient facilities for its people in a 65-year doubling time, 65 to 70 years, in spite of the fact that we have very fine supply of capital, in spite of the fact that we have a largely literate population, in spite of the fact that we have a good communication system, a good transport system, in spite of the fact that we are able to steal from the rest of the world whatever we need in the form of resources. We have the military power to back it up. We're able to maintain troops in Southeast Asia and places like that to guarantee that we get what other people need. In spite of that, we can't keep up. Now, what does a poor country like Honduras do when it hasn't got the Marines to send to Vietnam and grab the oil and grab the tin and so on? It's quite a problem for those countries. In fact, it's quite clear that although they have rising expectations, a little arithmetic will show you that they have plunging prospects. So we have a world with an incredibly rapidly growing population, far beyond any country can even think of keeping up with. But what about the condition of the people we have today? We have 3.6 billion people. Some of you may have heard funny people from agriculture tell you how easily we're going to feed 7.2 billion people in 30 years. One, however, is sort of obliged to ask them, how come you're not feeding 3.6 billion people today? In fact, you're not even feeding half of them. Well over half the people in the world have inadequate diets. Often they are undernourished, that is, they get too few calories. More often, they are malnourished. Ordinarily, they get not enough high-quality protein. And if you don't get enough high-quality protein when you're very young, either a fetus, and there you get it indirectly from your mother's diet, or when you're an infant, you tend to grow up, among other things, mentally retarded, and you often don't grow up at all because you're carried away by some disease like the common cold. Right now, between 10 and 20 million people a year are dying of starvation on this planet, some of them in the United States, every year. You may have heard a lot of silly stories about green revolutions and so on, which are a testimony to the power of the propaganda organization known as the Department of Agro-Business in the United States government. But maybe some of you saw, for instance, on First Tuesday last night, the films of continuing famine in India. All of that is going to get worse and worse. In fact, almost all the attempts we're making to increase food supply are being done in ecologically ridiculous ways and are going to have precisely the opposite effect. In other words, we are reducing the carrying capacity of the planet rapidly. Now, I wish I could tell you that the problem was just a simple one of balance between people and food. Of course it isn't. I could say, however, that we could do a lot better with the food we've got if we were interested in distributing it in something like an equitable fashion. The food, of course, on the surface of the earth is not equitably distributed. If you think of the sort of southern two-thirds of the earth as the other world, the hungry nations, as you will, where protein starvation is endemic everywhere, essentially, with a few exceptions, of course, like Argentina, you find, if you look at the pattern of protein flow between the overdeveloped and the underdeveloped countries, that the overdeveloped countries take 7 units of protein for every 5 they give back. There are, for instance, I was told by an idiot from Denmark, that, look at us, you know, we are food self-sufficient. We export pork and we export dairy products. What he didn't know, of course, is what a lot of people don't know, and that is that Denmark imports more protein per capita than any other country in the world. It just imports it in the form of fishes that are used as animal feed, and soybean press cakes and so on, very high protein food that could feed people but is used to feed animals. I could point out that we, the overdeveloped nations of the world, take 10 million metric tons of fishes from the Peruvian anchovy fishery. That is 1/6 of the entire fisheries production of the oceans of the world, and feed it to our cats, our dogs, our pigs, our chickens, and so on. Therefore, getting out of it when we eat the animals we feed, and we don't always do that, very few people eat their cats and dogs, but when we eat the animals that they feed, we only get 1/10 the food value, of course, that the Peruvians, who are protein starved, could get out of it eating it directly. Professor George Borgstrom at the Michigan State University described the protein situation in the world as a vast swindle. I think that's an understatement. Well, we have this dramatic food problem, but of course, all that time back 10,000 years ago, when we started taking up agriculture, we really put down the roots of what's our even more serious problem, and that is the problem of environmental deterioration. If the only balance was food and people, we could say very simply that there'll be one of two solutions. Either people will limit the size of the population by drastically curtailing the number of births, or the size will be limited, as it is in any animal population, by the surplus simply dying off, maybe almost all. And so you could count sometime in the next 10 or 20 years of the death of 2 or 3 billion people, at which time we would have a population back in balance with the carrying capacity of the Earth, since most of our estimates give us about a carrying capacity of somewhere around 500 million at an absolute maximum on a permanent basis. But it's not that simple, you see, because we have our neat little spaceship here with its very complicated life support systems involving all kinds of ecological systems which we know enough about to know that they're very delicate and very complex and easily destroyed. And besides just having overpopulated them, using up the resources at an incredible rate, we are also taking sledgehammers to those life support systems. Now, you may think that the big danger, say in Los Angeles, is the smog. Now, it's quite true. If you raise your children in Los Angeles, they will die young, and they will die young in all probability from emphysema, cardiovascular disease, any number of kinds of neat cancers. If PG&E gets its way, they will be carrying all kinds of mutant genes in all probability, because you're going to have lovely nuclear power plants here, a technology which is nowhere near ready to put into service, but we're going to have it anyway, and so forth. It's a very dangerous place to live, and there will be all kinds of nasty effects. People will die young. People are dying right now, of course, as the medical school here pointed out very clearly about 2 years ago. Nobody who doesn't have a pressing reason to remain in the Los Angeles basin should live here. You should flee for your lives. Well, that's only a small part of it. Actually, that's unimportant. So what if we knock back the life expectancy 20 or 30 years and people die on the average at 35 or 40? They will have done their reproducing. The species can continue. It continued for millions and millions of years with a life expectancy in the vicinity of 30 years. So that really isn't a problem except for individuals. Much more serious is how is the species going to persist if there is no food, which is an interesting point, and no mechanism for producing food, and if there is no way of getting rid of our wastes, and if the atmosphere turns out not to be made up permanently of nitrogen and oxygen, those things we evolved with, but rather a mixture of rather nasty gases and all kinds of other things that we don't want to be taking in. Because what the most serious aspect of environmental deterioration is the subtle assaults which we are carrying out on the life support systems of the planet. Now, there are many, many of these, and I'm just going to briefly describe two of them. One you're probably already familiar with, and that is the release into the environment of a wide variety of chlorinated hydrocarbons. These include a wide range of pesticides, DDT being the best known of them, but there's a list as long as your arm, and perhaps even more importantly, the polychlorinated biphenyls, a series of chlorinated hydrocarbons used as industrial solvents, which, among other things, vaporize from the tires of your car as you drive along the road, and so forth. A form of smog, by the way, that Ford is not going to cure with a gasoline additive, or any other company, obviously. Now, these chlorinated hydrocarbons have four very interesting characteristics, and I'm going to go over them very fast. One is they're deadly poisons. That's why they're used as pesticides. They kill you stone cold dead because your physiology is not that different from an insect. They may get you more slowly or more rapidly. It depends on the one you use. But fundamentally, they are a threat to human life directly and a threat to all kinds of life because, as I'll explain later, they have a certain affinity for life. So they're very deadly poisons. Number two, they are extremely mobile. They travel around very rapidly in the environment. They vaporize into the air. They co-distill with water. They cling to dust particles. DDT is now the most ubiquitous molecule made by man. It is found everywhere in the world. Antarctica, the Arctic, and all the way around. Number three, they're extraordinarily persistent. They hang around in the environment sometimes essentially forever. We don't know exactly how persistent in most cases because they're so mobile. If you dump 10 pounds of DDT in your backyard, and you come back next year and find out how much DDT is left and there's only 5, that doesn't mean that bacteria broke down the other 5 into some kind of harmless residue. Not at all. We know that a very large amount of it will have moved on, gone somewhere else. Some of the immediate breakdown products of DDT, for instance, which are themselves extremely dangerous poisons, appear to be essentially immortal in ecological systems. That is, they'll be around forever. The fourth characteristic we have that they're poisonous, number one, very poisonous. Number two, that they are extremely mobile. Number three, they are extremely persistent. And number four, to put the topper to it, they are extremely soluble in fats. You can think of it as these molecules, when they see fat, they dive in. As a result, if you think of the world as being made up of a biotic portion, a living portion, and a non-living portion, these materials are constantly swept out of the environment, out of the non-living environment, and into organisms. If you want to find DDT someplace, you don't go around and dip up a pail of water and look for it in the water. You go and shoot yourself a moose or catch a seal or do something else and look in there, or pick a plant, and you will find DDT in it. And the reason is they combine with fats. All organisms contain fats. Virtually all important biological processes go on in cells and in membranous organelles and little devices made out of membranes, and biological membranes have a fatty component. And so these things concentrate in biological systems. What's worse, beyond this, they tend to concentrate as they move up food chains. If you think of, say, a food chain consisting of, well, all of you know, I hope, that all flesh is grass. Ultimately, all your food comes from green plants. Have a field of grain, say 1,000 pounds of grain. You feed a cow on it. For every 1,000 pounds of grain that you feed the cows, you will get roughly 100 pounds of cow. The second law of thermodynamics guarantees you that you can't make a perfect conversion. And for every 100 pounds of cow, if you feed cow to people, you get 10 pounds of people. And for every 10 pounds of people you feed the mosquitoes, you get 1 pound of mosquitoes. You get about that's an oversimplification, but roughly you lose 90% of the material and energy at each transfer. You don't lose 90% of the DDT. Almost all of it hangs around, so that if you had on the plant originally 1 part per million of DDT on the wheat, you get 10 parts per million of DDT in the cow, 100 parts per million of DDT in the man, and 1,000 parts per million of DDT in the mosquito. Since some of the longest food chains are in the oceans, the concentration there towards the top of the food chains gets to be quite spectacular, and that's why we're saying goodbye to the brown pelican and probably to all the predatory birds of the world now. Now, you of course say, well, what the hell do those dicky birds mean to me? Well, unfortunately, we eat high up on food chains, and the very structure, the food-producing mechanism is, remember, part of a very complicated system which depends on its stability for its complexity. When you start poisoning out sections of this system, you see, what you're essentially doing is at random pulling tubes out of the computer, and you're still expecting the computer to do the job for you. By the way, this whole thing illustrates an important principle we call the Seaboard Principle, named after the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, who is world-renowned as one of the most ecologically ignorant people in government, and that's that's quite a stretch. I mean, that's a big competition he won in. The Seaboard Principle is stated as follows: if you have a quart of hot radioactive waste and you pour it into the ocean, which has 60 billion quarts of water, that the concentration of this radioactive waste in the ocean will be 1 over 60 billion. Now, this is the philosophy used by everybody who dumps crap into the environment of whatever kind. The idea is that it will become evenly dispersed. But by the way, you only count your crap too. If the guy next to you is pouring a quart of hot radioactive waste into the ocean, you don't worry about what he's doing. Well, that's the Seaboard Principle. Like most of the things he says, the truth happens to be 180 degrees away from it. One thing we know for sure is that biological systems concentrate things. In fact, as a matter of fact, if there weren't biological systems, you wouldn't expect even dispersion, at least not for a very long time. But as long as you've got biological systems, you can count on them concentrating things. In fact, the AEC, if it had any capability to learn, which it apparently does not, could have learned that 20 years ago when they used to drip red-hot stuff into the Savannah River and run downstream and stick in Geiger counters. And they found there was no significant increase, quote, significant, end quote, increase in the radioactivity. And so they kept right on doing it until somebody pointed out to them that the clams at the river mouth were glowing in the dark. But like I say, the AEC is an organism without ability to learn, unlike the FAA, the Department of Agribusiness, the President, and so on. Now, this is a very important thing to remember. For instance, if you love oysters and clams like I do, you ought to suffer by not eating them, because of course now, since they, besides having the natural properties of concentration along food chains, they're filter feeders, and so they really tend to concentrate things, and they can be extraordinarily dangerous. So we have this problem of poisoning out of ecological systems. I should point out to you, by the way, just to get back for a second to radioactive waste, that a great deal of these things with half-lives of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years, white hot, have been dumped into the deep seas in 50-gallon drums lined with concrete on the AEC assumption that a 50-gallon drum lined with concrete is immortal. In fact, man is now starting to do something which he has never done before and which there's no reason to believe he can do. That is, this whole nuclear power plant program is based on the idea that you can take extremely deadly materials, which if they get out into the environment as a whole could easily mean the end not just of our species but ultimately of all life on Earth, and contain them for thousands of years. In other words, through essentially geologic time. Nobody's ever even attempted that. And maybe you saw, again, those of you who saw first, I think it was on First Tuesday last night, maybe it was on the news, the fact that apparently the huge tanks of white-hot stuff they've got at Hanford are right on an earthquake fault, but the AEC guarantees us there will be no earthquakes there. Besides being stupid, they also happen to be omniscient, which is convenient. So, all right, one example of an assault on a life support system, the adding of one of many of the poisons that we're adding to ecological systems. I could have told you a similar story about many of the radioactive substances, about lead, about many of the things that go along with oil spills, about fluorides. There's just a fantastically long list, and the stories are similar in general nature but different in detail. We know more about DDT and chlorinated hydrocarbons than most of the others, but there's no reason to believe that you can relax about a whole wide variety of things. Now, the other thing is the subtle effect of air pollution on the weather. I don't want to go into details now. If somebody wants to ask questions, I can. But there are many things, besides air pollution being one of them, that we are doing to change the climate of the planet. Now, there are a long list, depending on which way it goes, and nobody knows for sure, a long list of hideous disasters I could describe. But just let's skip them. I mean, there is, for instance, if we have a big volcanic explosion, we could easily have no summer in the northern hemisphere last year, just like we did in 1816 after Tambora went up. And that would be the end of the world food problem because, you know, we'd lose maybe 1 billion people from starvation right on the spot. But skipping even that sort of thing, if climate changes rapidly, and there's every sign that it's doing it, we've had all kinds of record weather, for instance, in the last couple of years, there's every sign that it's doing it. The thing that will suffer most is agriculture, because in spite of what you may read in Time magazine, agriculture is tremendously dependent, essentially completely dependent on the quality of the soil and on the weather. When the weather changes, agriculture suffers. People are extremely conservative in their agricultural practices. They will not change them rapidly, which means if you change the climate, you are going to reduce the world's food supply. This isn't the time to reduce the world's food supply, and I'll be glad to give you some details on that if you're curious. So we have this kind of thing going on, subtle assaults, which make biologists a little sick when you have a distinguished president of the United States get up and think that he can solve the problem by building some sewage treatment plants, which, as Barry Commoner pointed out at the Northwestern teach-in right after that silly speech, would just make the problem worse. I should point out to you, by the way, that $10 billion was not going to come from the federal government, only $4 billion over 10 years. That's $0.4 billion a year to build sewage treatment plants, which will make the problem worse. That last year, as far as I can gather, Nixon didn't spend more than a half, I think it was maybe only a third of the money that was appropriated by the Congress to clean up our waters. So we don't let any politician fool you. We have not moved one single step in this country towards population control or environmental cleanup. Anybody who thinks that we are, for instance, taking care of our environmental problems, go back to the obvious ones and just look out the window. Same thing in the Bay Area. I was asked by a Bay Area cameraman on a day that was even worse than this, do you really think we're winning the fight against air pollution? You know, you got to use your eyes. Okay, so we have a very serious problem, but I really haven't mentioned the two most serious prospects that we face. One is, of course, thermonuclear war, and from all the analysis the political scientists can do, the answer keeps coming out the same. Every person you add to the planet increases the chances. The reason is really very simple. Resources are in dramatically short supply. After all, the United States, with 6% of the people of the world, feels it necessary to consume roughly 30% of the raw materials that are consumed annually. And of course, our friends and neighbors over in Northern Europe and so on have similar plans. In fact, our projected demands alone will consume all there is in the crust of the earth of certain critical resources before the early part of the next century is out. For instance, like copper. Just us, not any of our friends in the overdeveloped countries, not any of the underdeveloped countries, just for us. So the resource situation is getting critical. Seems highly unlikely to me until we change our economic system that we will ever withdraw our troops from Southeast Asia, or that we will withdraw our sub-rosa support and essentially troops from Latin America, that we will have a sane policy in the Near East or anywhere else. In other words, our present system and the legions marching overseas and so on are a simple reflection of the network that we have created, the economic network, which guarantees that the protein and the copper and the titanium and so on and so forth flow from them to us. As long as we feel the need for that, the troops are going to keep on marching. That's why I'm very much amused by the obvious tactic of the president, the vice president, Mr. Mitchell, certain extremely wealthy people I know and so on, to think that if you get the students off of race and you get the students off of the war, we'll get them on a nice, safe issue like environment where we know nothing's going to be done, but they can make a lot of noise and everybody's in favor of it. Those people, I hope, are in for a very sorry surprise. Now, I don't want to go into great detail about what we ought to do. I like to give you the broad outline and leave it at that. It's quite obvious, first of all, that population control begins at home. The most serious population growth in the world takes place among affluent white Americans. As I've said many times, the birth of the average American child puts 50 times the strain on the environment of the world as the birth of the average Indian child. The birth of the average American child consumes roughly 300 times the non-renewable resources as the birth of the average Indonesian child. If you think that it's really a problem of the poor and the blacks, you've got another thing coming, because although it's true that poor blacks, for instance, have a slightly higher birth rate than poor whites, relatively affluent blacks, and there are very few of them, have a lower birth rate than relatively affluent whites. And if you look at the consumption and pollution problem, the same sort of thing holds true between blacks and whites in this country as holds true between Americans and Indians, or Americans and Indonesians. At any rate, the blacks have correctly recognized that when people talk population control, no small portion of them are thinking about genocide, in the sense that they really think somebody else ought to control their population while us good guys go on and keep breeding it up. There just is no support for that any more than there is for any other racist theory. It just is the unfortunate thing. As long as you're going to have whites talking about population control, you're going to have racists talking about population control, and it's a fact of life. So to those of you who think that the blacks ought to control their population and have the same number of babies as whites, I suggest a very simple strategy, and I give an absolute personal guarantee it will work. That is, simply give the blacks the same economic opportunities, the same educational opportunities, the same respect, the same social opportunities, and so on and so forth as the whites have, and I personally guarantee you that their birth rate will converge instantaneously on the white birth rate, and you won't be faced with that little problem anymore. So, the first thing we have to do here and elsewhere is get the population under control. That won't solve the problems of race and war and pollution and so on and so forth. It'll buy you a ticket to let you try and solve them, however. Obviously, nobody around the world is going to listen to anything we tell them about population control until we get our own skyrocketing population under control, and until we show them that we are serious about taking the stress off the resources, about transitioning from what Kenneth Boulding called a cowboy economy, which focuses on tremendous levels of waste, consumption, production. The basic principle, we named it a cowboy economy because the idea was, you foul your nest and then you move on west. You can just leave the slop behind. Well, of course, those of us who are pressed against the ocean don't see any way to do that anymore. And transition to a spaceman economy in which we maximize the quality of the goods we have, both physical and human, and in which everything is recycled at the highest possible level of recycling. Remember, with the exception of the fossil fuels, we don't ordinarily destroy the resources that we use, we disperse them. The molecules are still there, but we can't afford to try and spend the energy to regather them. So what you want to do is minimize that dispersal so that our species can persist on the planet maybe for several million years instead of for several tens of years or even less than that. The use of fossil fuels, of course, has to be cut back as rapidly as possible, not just to save the environment, but also because our future generations are going to need those large molecules for other things than breaking apart the bonds and extracting the energy. They're going to need them to make plastics. They're going to need them for lubrication. As I think any organic chemist will tell you, it's criminal to take those big complex molecules and burn them, essentially. That should be absolutely minimized. Now, if you get funny, some of you may, how many of you get bills from PG&E any time in your life? That's too bad, because you have a wonderful experience, They'll send you a bill, and they will say, gee whiz, you got to buy a new electric oven, and it's really important you go out and get yourself an electric air conditioner, and so on and so forth. And you're supposed to buy all this stuff, and then during the summer they tell you not to use it because they can't supply the demand. And then they go into the newspapers. There was an idiot up in the Bay Area screaming that California was in a race for its life against power demand, and we have to flood the entire rest of the state and sink nuclear reactors in the ponds and on and on to keep up with this fantastic demand, or we're going to go under. Now, of course, not being literate, he wouldn't know that in Western Europe, people seem to be not in a race for their lives, only using 1/2 the power per capita that we do. But it's very amusing to see the supposed public entity on one side doing everything possible to build up the demand, and on the other side doing everything possible to wreck the state, to destroy our farmlands, to put up extraordinarily dangerous nuclear reactors in order to supply the demand that they have created. I would hypothesize, for instance, it would be possible for Californians to live very wonderful, full lives if the billboards weren't illuminated all through the night. In fact, I think you might even survive if the streets weren't lit, although maybe not in some areas. It's hard to say. In other words, the idea is what you've got to put over to these people, and of course you've got to do it in Dick and Jane type books, is if you got a big demand and you can do two things about it. You can either destroy yourself trying to supply it, or you can find ways to reduce the demand, and there are all kinds of effective ways to reduce the demand, of course. So once we get our own mess cleaned up, then we can turn to the rest of the world and say, okay, we would like to help you control your population, and we would like to help you to some reasonable level of development so that your people have decent food, decent housing, decent education, and the things that you need which we can produce in a technological industrialized society. You can point out very simply with arithmetic that it's impossible to industrialize the world, even if it wouldn't destroy it ecologically. But of course that would require a complete revision of our thinking in international trade, a complete revision of our thinking, which of course in our country, and with them now aping us, leads people to the confusion the growth of the gross national product is in some way growth in the quality of life rather than what it's proven to be over the last 30 years, a decrease in the quality of life. So it's a monster job. It will involve, by the way, from every estimate that has been made on either side of the Iron Curtain, from anybody that's looked into it as far as I know, absolute minimum commitment on the part of the United States of something on the order of $50 billion a year, and equivalent amounts from all the other overdeveloped countries, the Soviet Union, the Japanese, Western Europe, and so forth. Now, of course, the big question is, what are the chances that we will get off of our present course and make the tremendous shifts that are required, first of all, to change our hideous economic system, and second of all, to get our reproduction under control? And my answer is, of course, that I'm very optimistic that if we did it, we could improve our chances of survival, say, to the year 2000, with a reasonable world to something like 50-50, but I'm very pessimistic about whether or not we will do it. One of the big factors is whether or not student interest in this problem and all of the connecting things of race and war and so on and so forth is really just a fad like a lot of people think, so whether or not there is a generation of students who really is determined to do something about it. So fundamentally, it's up to you. Thank you.
There are mics on either side of the auditorium, and if you have questions so that everyone might hear, please go to this side, and Dr. Ehrlich can take questions for about a half an hour.
See, where are the mics? Whoever's got a question, shoot.
Doctor,
Yeah.
in your book, you said that certain areas of the world were probably beyond hope in their race against food production versus population. Among these areas, you listed Egypt and surrounding areas, China, India, and possibly Indonesia, I guess, by implication. Now, how you propose that certain areas would, if we got really enlightened, could be saved, and other areas would just have to be left to politically and socially disintegrate because there's nothing that we could do, that the situation had gotten so out of hand. Now, how is it you propose to keep those areas, while they're politically and socially disintegrating, from looking over at the countries that we're saving, that aren't politically and socially disintegrating, and keeping them from having some sort of violent osmotic process where they go in and try and obtain the benefits.
That's an excellent question. First of all, let me point out that I was essentially quoting the Paddocks and their triage system there, and I have not changed the view that I held then, that their point of view is eminently reasonable, but it's got to be worded properly. That is, the point is that we have let things go so far that we are no longer in a position to help everyone, certainly not with the kinds of attitudes we have now. It might be different if we change things. Now the question comes down to, if you're not going to help if you can't help everyone, what do? Do you give everybody inadequate aid, or do you concentrate your aid on those that you have a chance of saving? The Paddock's answer was that, hideous as it is, you have to concentrate your aid, as you do in a military hospital, not on those that are going to die regardless, not on those that are going to survive regardless, but on those that have a chance of getting to self-sufficiency with your help. I personally doubt if it'll ever be done country by country, but you see, one of the hideous things is that when people get to a certain level of malnutrition and so on, they just don't have the energy. They haven't got the brains, because, again, one of the things that happens to you when you're malnourished is that your mind goes and so on, to make much of a fuss. And that's why people are starving to death in huge numbers around the world now, and most Americans can go on, even with programs like First Tuesday and so on, and just essentially ignore it. So I think you can see, for instance, that without I don't want to make any value judgments. Without Soviet intervention, it seems a little difficult to believe that Egypt, for instance, would be charging in and taking food away from the Israelis, or that India would be taking food away from the West Pakistanis, for instance. Now, one of the great overlays of the whole problem, of course, is, yes, how do you there's no choice. What happens when huge numbers of people start starving to death? What happens to the world political system? And that's what we're seeing. In other words, the book was written in 1968. Nothing, absolutely nothing, has been done since then to tackle the fundamental problems. More and more people are starving to death every year. We're seeing the start of the whole thing. Now, that's one of the things that can make you pessimistic, because a lot of people won't starve easily. And one of the really hideous problems, which I forgot to mention. I was going to mention two hideous problems, and I only got through thermonuclear war. One of the problems, of course, is worldwide disease. You see, first of all, every little country with any brains in it anyway, and that means almost every little country, is quite capable of building biological weapons that will take mankind out as a whole. Now, we don't have to depend on biological warfare. We are now a perfect setup for a worldwide virus plague. We have the largest population the world's ever seen, we have the weakest population the world's ever seen, and we have transportation that will take people from continent to continent in a matter of hours. In 1967, a virus transferred from monkeys to men in Germany, which was fortunately contained. It was highly contagious and highly lethal. In a well-fed, well-cared-for population, it killed 7 out of 30 people who contracted it. If it had gotten out in the population as a whole, it quite likely could have killed 2 billion or more people, or it's really decimated the world population. It was in the London airport 2 weeks before, in the monkeys, 2 weeks before they got to the laboratory in Marburg, Germany. In other words, if the transfer to man had taken place with people at the London airport, we probably wouldn't be holding this meeting. The virus is still around. Many similar viruses are still around. So that's one of the big possibilities. And so little nations don't really have to sit still and take it. And it's going to be interesting to see.
In your book, you suggest that people like ourselves become very active in trying to get the word to the public. In Los Angeles here, we have a group called Zero Population Growth Incorporated, and we have several projects, including getting to the public with public demonstrations, getting to legislators, manning tables like we have in the back of the room. We have a chapter very close here. Do you think that such groups will be very helpful?
Well, I of course am a great fan of zero population growth, because it is the first of all, I'm very deeply involved in it. I was a shill. And second of all, it is the only group which first of all says we're going to stop population growth and clean up the environment, period. No ifs, ands, and buts. No, we'll do it if industry will go along, or we'll do it if a profit can still be made, or we'll do it sometime in the next century and so on. We're just going to do it. Second of all, it is not tax deductible. In other words, if you got to save the world on 50-cent dollars, the hell with it. It's probably not worth saving. And it's politically action-oriented. It's opened a lobbying office in Washington, the Hawaiian group has a permanent lobbyist in the Hawaiian state legislature. We are going to be supporting Brown against the fighter's son here for the Democratic senatorial nomination, because Mr. Tunney, in one hand, says he's a great environmentalist, on the other hand is against abortion. That's like being in favor of Al Capone but against crime. And the whole idea is, since we haven't got time to tear down the system if we wanted to, and since there's no guarantee what we rebuilt will be any better, the idea is to be activists and use the system against the people who have co-opted it. There's no reason why the pressure groups have to run the United States. There's no reason why we have to elect rustics to Congress from safe districts and let them have seniority and let them sell out to the Eastern banking interests that want to occupy Vietnam to keep their investments safe and so on. That doesn't have to be. You can go out and work for and against political right in this room, right now, there are enough people to elect any congressman in the United States if you go into this district and work for him, say, half-time for the last 3 months of the campaign. There's plenty of power among the students of the United States if it's used right. If you go and you drive people to the polls and you go door to door and you use phones for the candidate and you stuff envelopes and so on to get people elected. And that's the kind of language that politicians understand. A lot of them aren't too bright, but they understand votes. And that's what we've got to do, and that's what ZPG is organizing people to do. Whether it'll work or not depends on how many people get excited enough to do some work. By the way, I should contrast for you. I just remembered. I copied down something. I usually don't like to write down things in speeches, but I wanted to show you, after having heard a wonderful speech on the whole situation from Mr. Nixon, let me give you another quote, which I think is more interesting, from a much more sophisticated politician. Huge populations alone do not make nations great. We are moving into an age in which quality rather than quantity determines the power of nations and their influence in international affairs. By choosing to emphasize quality in its policies on population, the government has taken a decision which will have a major impact on the lives of future generations of Ghanaians. That was the Commissioner of Economic Affairs, Mr. Amboe of Ghana. So now Ghana has joined India as being examples of countries that are miles ahead of intelligence and foresight and so on of the American government. Of course, if you listen to the American government talk or watch it play golf, it's not hard to understand why. John Wayne could not have written that speech.
Dr. Ehrlich,
Yeah.
are you at all familiar with the environmental teaching that's being pulled together out of Washington, D.C. as a national effort for April 22nd?
Another shill, by God. I am on the committee for the environmental teaching that is
Okay.
going to be
Can
pulled
you-
together out
can
of
you-
Washington, D.C. for April 22nd. It's going to hopefully run in every university and every college in the country, in many high schools and a great many junior high schools, and it is my personal hope, not the hope of the teaching committee, but my personal hope that it will result in massive political action on the part of our young people all the way down to the junior highs. Remember, you don't have to vote to take political action. You'd be amazed how much luck a lot of the kids in my daughter's junior high school have had arguing with their parents. And when kids come home from school and start presenting facts that the parents have no way of rebutting, of course there's the usual reaction of going and screaming at the school that the kids are getting educated and turning communist. There's an enormous amount that you can do, and among other things, you can just embarrass your elders by knowing so much more than they do, but don't get swelled heads about it because it isn't much of an accomplishment. Yeah.
Dr. Ehrlich,
Yeah.
your book challenged me to write a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, which will be released in April. If it wouldn't insult you, I'd like to send you a copy of it. But
You didn't write the late great state of California by any chance?
no, but it was interesting. But what I wanted to throw out, I'm not essentially a religious person, but naturally, as I look at the things that experts like you tell me, and I seek to psych out what's in the future, I began to study prophecy as it's revealed in the Bible. And I wondered if you had considered any of the predictive pattern, which is rather precise, which is given in the Bible about the days that it would immediately precede the second coming of Jesus of Nazareth to the earth.
No. Thanks,
I
Bud.
think you should.
do I understand you to say correctly that the nuclear power plant technology available today is not ready for worldwide consumption and distribution? And if that is correct, on what evidence is that based upon?
Oh, well, that's primarily the judgment of people who know the nuclear power industry and nuclear power technology, like Dr. John Holdren at Stanford, who's a plasma physicist, and Drs. Goffman and Tamplin, who work for the Atomic Energy Commission. If you want the details, there are two very good books, one called Perils of the Peaceful Atom and the other called something similar. It doesn't matter. But the story is essentially this. They haven't even solved the problem of how to clad the fuel. They have two primary problems. One is the disposal of the white-hot wastes that that are generated in the fuel tubes. There's much more radioactivity concentrated there, which if than there is, say, in a full-scale hydrogen bomb explosion. The problem is, how do you contain them during production while you're producing power, and what do you do with them afterwards? And the second problem is, what do you do about the levels of leakage of things like krypton-85 and so on into the environment? And the answer is that they don't know how to do either. That in fact, in one AEC plant, the fast breeder outside of Detroit, the Fermi fast breeder, they came within a hair's breadth, admittedly, of an accident which would have killed millions of Americans and made 10% of the country uninhabitable right on the spot. I have yet to meet a single person, short of Glenn Seaborg or some of his shills in the upper levels of the AEC, who would live within 500 miles downwind of a nuclear power plant without coercion. In fact, I can cite a wonderful source. Have you ever heard of a Dr. Edward Teller? Now, Dr. Teller's solution to all social problems, any problem, is blow up an H-bomb in it. You know, he wanted to blow up an H-bomb on the moon. He wanted to solve the water problems in New York by blowing up an H-bomb. I'm sure he will come to the Central City problem soon. Even Teller, who, you know, is strung out on this sort of thing, said that nuclear power plants do not belong on the surface of the earth. They should at least be buried. If you look at the disposal problem, you find that even if they solve the problem of getting rid of the really hot wastes for at least hundreds of years by solidifying them and putting them in salt mines, and mind you, they have to be kept out of circulation for thousands of years, and that really takes faith in geological process. But even if they solve that, with a pattern of increase of number of plants that they have now, by the year 2000, there will be something on the order, I can't remember the exact figure, I think it is 3,000 trucks in transit at any given instant to salt mines containing essentially, say, 10 or 20 times the radioactivity that was released by the Hiroshima bomb. So you're going to have to be very careful drivers, among other things.
Why can't you shoot it to the sun?
Shoot it into the sun.
Yes, all the ways.
Well, there are just little tiny problems there of what happens to the atmosphere when you start sending off that many rockets. I mean, it's an interesting problem. Nobody has yet, the amounts of this stuff are absolutely colossal. Now, it takes a lot of fuel to launch 3 goons to the moon, you know, and it tends to be just a little bit expensive. So if they do solve the problem of the solid waste, you still have the problem of what do you do about the very large number of very dangerous things that are released in the process otherwise. You say, well, why don't you design the reactor so it will contain them? And the answer is that it is not economically feasible at the present time to design a reactor to contain them, because most of these isotopes are extremely similar to their non-radioactive counterparts, and sorting them out requires first a lot of energy and second technological know-how we don't have. Now, this is not saying that we should never have nuclear power. The point is, you see, that the AEC has a dual role, unfortunately. Like many of our government agencies, it isn't just to regulate the use of atomic energy, it's also to promote it. Right now we have the spectacle of 2 of the most distinguished health physicists in the United States at the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory, which is supported by AEC funds, pointing out repeatedly and with massive evidence that the AEC's radiation guidelines for acceptable doses and release to the environment are set at least 10 times too high. And the AEC keeps countering with brilliant statements about no they aren't. Never any data, never any counter-arguments, just no they aren't. We have a serious problem there. I think we would probably be much better off simply to reduce our demand on the fossil fuels and stick with them for 20 or 30 years until we can move to deuterium-helium fusion, in which case you can get by, and there's every reason to think we can probably make it, you can get by with no pollution of the environment except for heat pollution. Of course, any use of energy gives you heat pollution, which puts a very severe limit on how much energy you can use at any time. But the present state of the nuclear art, I have never seen anything more uniformly in the opinion of both physicists and biologists, but don't. Because you see, once you exhaust the radiation budget of the Earth, you're finished. That's all there is. There is no more. In other words, it's a pollution problem that you just can't get rid of. And it's a very serious one. So the risks that the AEC is running now with us and our kids and future generations are absolutely spectacular, but they're willing to do it because, among other things, of course, you've got to be pretty dull to work for a government agency. Over here.
This isn't really a question. This is a public service announcement almost. There are many groups on campus that are working to get reforms just out of the university alone. And I'm mentioning this because most people don't even know that next month it will be possible for co-eds to get abortions at the UCLA Med Center. That phenomena came about because of the work of about 40 women. There are groups like Zero Population Growth, there are groups like Ecology Action that need your time and need you. And you need them because many of the groups have been active for a year or so and have gotten to the point where they know people like Art Seidenbaum and Art Buchwalds and Nat Weinstock and people like that. In the next few days in the Daily Bruin, there are going to be some advertisements which will tell you, or at least give you information about groups that you can contact to get more information about things like the population problem. I mention this all because it is almost impossible to communicate with this number of people. We are pushing and pushing and pushing the registrar to let us put stuff into packets so that people, at least in this city, men and women can be informed about the kind of services that are available, contraception, as well as the kind of deception that's going along. The university is a mixed blessing. It's, in its conservatism, it's part our enemy, and in its desire to be helpful, it's our friend.
All I'll say is amen.
Okay, thank you.
It seems to me as if the scientists have a tough road to go, trying to convince the people in this country to wake up before it's too late. I think possibly Plato, in writing something that Aristotle said, possibly had the answer, and I wondered if I could have your view. He thought at the time that the philosophers, who were the scientists of the day, should be the politicians. Do you think men in your position would make good politicians?
No, I
rather
don't.
than fighting them?
But I say this. I think one of the most serious problems is that we have very cleverly oversold science. One of the things that's really too bad is that a great many Americans think that in some way science and technology are going to pull a rabbit out of the hat at the last minute to solve these problems. However, associating all the time with academicians and scientists, I would say that I would find them a no more or less desirable group to draw our politicians from than any other group in the society. The point is that we are faced with a dramatic series of technological and problems that require technological and scientific judgment, particularly in the areas of biology, particularly in the areas of behavioral sciences. And yet the government, you see, where does it go for its science advice? It goes to old-time physicists who may be very well-meaning but just don't know what's going on in the world. What we need really are some ombudsmen for humanity, essentially. Some people who are somehow arrayed to deal with the government, perhaps with veto powers, but utterly divorced from the executive structure, from the legislature and so on, from the kinds of pressures which have meant that all the other regulatory agencies get eventually taken over, by the foxes who end up guarding the henhouse. If you look at who runs the regulatory agencies, of course, it's the industries that are supposed to be regulated. Somehow, you have got to, the appointment, for instance, of the three, quote, ecologists, or whatever they were supposed to be, for the President's Environmental Board, which is going to be, hoo-ha, equal to the Board of Economic Advisors. Well, of course, the Board of Economic Advisors ought to be completely subordinate to whoever deals with ecological problems, because it's abundantly evident that any economic system has to work within physical and biological constraints. That's number one. Number two, the three people who were appointed, there wasn't one person who was even even had pretensions of being an ecologist. Three people who deal with the environment, one a judge, one a newspaper reporter, and one a physicist politician. So I don't think scientists should become politicians. Some might want to and others might not. But I think what you've got to do is have the political system set up so it can attract people with brains and talent. What happens now? The people who have nothing else to do but hang around the wards and so on eventually get recognized for their long service to the party and are elevated to high position. Or you get attorneys very often because they can leave their firms and come back. People with careers, people with ambition and so on, they're not interested in politics. They know very well, for instance, if you go into the House of Representatives, the United States Senate, you'll be there almost forever until you get any power, because the power is all held in the hands of these 70-year-old committee chairmen. You talk to some of the good young congressmen and the good young senators, they have tears in their eyes all the time. They can put all the bills in they want, and a parliamentarian sticks them over into Ways and Means or someplace and they're never seen again. There was a list of bills on population and environment as long as your arm that went in last year. None of them were acted on. I think one had hearings, and that's all there is. So we've got to change the political system so it attracts people with brains. Otherwise, you're going to have Nixons and Agnews and Johnsons and so on until hell freezes over. Somebody mentioned religious views and so on. I think we do need a religious change in our attitudes in this country towards man's role on the planet and towards nature and towards his fellow man and towards the joy of living and so on and so forth. But fundamentally what the conventional religion does for us, it was put very well by Eric Lundberg in The Rich and the Super Rich. We said is, if you can get somebody who will believe that Jesus walked on water and was born a virgin and so on, you'll get somebody who will believe that Johnson was a great statesman and that a 59-cent cosmetic will change your life. Basically, religion is used to keep people, in the treadmill. And until we get a shift in religion to some true religious values that focus on how human beings live, and that it's much more important, for instance, that we save a baby that's starving to death and prevent the birth of another baby who would just cause other babies to starve to death. That's much more important than, say, banning pornography from TV or something. Till you do that, I think it's hopeless.
Are you married? And if so, how many children do you have?
I am married. I have a 14-year-old daughter. I have a vasectomy. Over there.
Thank you.
You've mentioned quite a few problems. Which one do you think could hit the United States?
Oh, it depends, really. You have to cancel out the plague and the war, because all bets are off if that happens. If you skip the plague and you skip the war, and you don't have a weather change which gives us an instant starvation situation in the country, I think the thing that will probably get to most Americans first, since they probably won't pay attention to what's happening in the rest of the world, they rarely do, will be water shortage. We are really stretched very thin. All the geologists, all the water experts say the same thing. Just no way, the way the demand is going and so forth. The quality of the food will keep going down also. Meat, you see, is already transitioning out of the lives of a great many Americans, getting to be very, very expensive. That trend will continue. It's hard to say because there are just too many variables. What we're doing is playing environmental roulette. We got a lot of chambers and a lot of them are loaded, and we have it pressed right to our temple, and we keep pulling the trigger, and nobody knows when it'll come up. All you can say with any assurance is sometime in the next 10 to 20 years, if we don't do something dramatic, things like this will become no longer possible. Oh, the weather story is essentially this. The power that drives the weather is solar energy, of course. It comes in as short wavelengths. I'm going to oversimplify it. It comes in as short wavelengths. The short wavelengths the atmosphere is transparent to, gets to the surface, warms the surface, where it's absorbed, the energy is absorbed, it's re-radiated as infrared, which is long wavelengths. The atmosphere is not transparent to long wavelengths. It is carbon dioxide, water vapor, and water droplets absorb infrared. They then are warmed, re-radiate more infrared, some back towards the surface and some outward, so that some of the energy is trapped near the surface. That's the so-called greenhouse effect. The pane of glass does the same thing as the atmosphere in a greenhouse. So the greenhouse is warmer than the surroundings. If we didn't have the greenhouse effect, instead of having an average surface temperature of about 60 degrees, we'd have one of around -7 to -10 degrees. That's one aspect of the heat balance. Another aspect of the heat balance is the so-called albedo of the planet, the percent of the short wavelength radiation that is not absorbed but is directly reflected back into space. That depends on the nature of the surface it hits. Water reflects, for instance, different amounts depending on the angle of incidence of the sun. Land reflects different amounts depending on whether it's desert or whether it's cultivated or whether it's forest. Whether there's ice on it, various kinds of ice have different reflectances, and clouds reflect. Okay, so basically the power comes in the heat balance, and the actual pattern of weather is determined by such things as the temperature gradient from pole to equator, and a lot of aspects of turbulent flow that we don't really understand very well. Now, we're doing all kinds of things to the heat balance and also to the local patterns. The first thing we did to the heat balance, apparently, and again, this is all semi-shaky, because, you know what the effects are, but the weather records aren't good enough to be certain exactly what's going on. And apparently, from about 1880 to about 1940, we warmed the planet by burning fossil fuels and putting so much CO2 into the atmosphere that it couldn't equilibrate rapidly with the oceans, or there wasn't enough capacity in the oceans. And so we increased the greenhouse effect and the planet warmed. Since then, there apparently has been an overpowering effect of crud put into the atmosphere, increasing the albedo. Dust from agricultural hazes in many parts of the world as they put more and more marginal land under cultivation, the kind of air pollution we see here, which has now become essentially worldwide. The turbidity of the atmosphere over the Central Pacific increased 33% during the last decade. The cirrus cloud cover over the North Atlantic, North America, and Europe has increased an estimated 15% from jet contrails alone during the last decade. And in fact, there are some people who think that if we should be so stupid as to fly the SSTs, you may get 100% cloud cover over those areas, which would be rather interesting. That increases the albedo. And there has been a cooling trend. Now, a cooling or warming trend over the entire Earth doesn't tell you what happens in any particular place, because, for instance, you might, by warming the Earth, speed up the atmospheric engine, circulate it faster, and so the air at the pole might be a half a degree warmer, but it would come down here twice as fast, and you might have a cooling trend here. So nobody knows whether we will continue to cool or whether we'll warm up again or something. All we know is that we're changing it. Now, what are some of the possibilities? With changing it alone, you screw up agriculture. But, for instance, cirrus clouds have funny interactions with jet streams that we don't understand. One of the things that can happen is you get a change in the pattern of the storm track across the United States, that would be, or the northern hemisphere, that would be so long to, for instance, our wheat belt and so on, an ice age perhaps in northern Canada. If the polar ice pack, not the cap, but the polar ice cap in the pack in the Arctic Ocean melts, as some people think it will, then it will not reform easily because the ice reflects heat, but the ocean would absorb more, and so the ocean would warm, and it wouldn't reform, and this would probably cause a shift in the jet stream. Again, the result from that might very well be a desert through most of the northern hemisphere, except the northern fringes, which would become rapidly covered with ice. Other people are afraid if you cool the entire planet. There is a very serious group of people who say that the ice ages in the past have started with a slump of the Antarctic ice pack, caused when the weight got so heavy that instead of just getting elastic flow at the bottom, you got liquid flow, and it just slumped out, increasing the area of ice dramatically, therefore increasing the reflectance of the planet, and therefore causing a cooling trend until the ice broke up. If the ice pack should slump, the estimates are that about half the people in the world will drown, because the tidal waves will be like something never seen before, except there are indications in the fossil record that this has occurred periodically before, and the cores of the ice of the Antarctic ice cap show the same kinds of signs, and we are cooling, you see, and cooling increases the weight of the cap. So that's the kind of, there's also the potential, if you warm the whole planet, of course, that the polar ice caps will melt, in which case you'd have a several 100-foot rise in the eustatic sea level, and you lose a lot of agricultural land and a lot of cities we probably wouldn't miss, but that would be a slower process. So there are all kinds of possible disasters, but I think the essential thing is not to worry about the small probability disasters there, because there's not a hell of a lot we can do about them, but what about just, the kinds of changes that you can get very rapidly by simply accelerating overall climatic change, which will screw up agriculture at a time when we can't afford to screw up agriculture. One more question.
I'd like to have your comment on a particular idea that myself and several of my friends are working on now. It's called World Life Day, and the main idea is what can we do now? And one of the ideas, a possibility, is to set up an international holiday with no boundaries according to religion, nationality, or anything else, but in terms of simply celebrating it as a kind of an ecology peace day. And the kind of things that would occur on a day like this would be things like silence, to listen to nature, to get into seeing where you are in your own head and in your surroundings, things like not driving a motor vehicle. You could plant a tree or start a garden, things such as this. You could resolve to have no more than 2 children, or if more, to adopt. All these kind of things would be the tradition of this kind of a holiday. I think that this would be a very good way of unifying many various kinds of people that are very concerned about ecology but come from all kinds of different areas of life. And it would be also a very good way, I think, of focusing in on the media so that the media could cover this particular idea, spread it around a little bit. All the ideas having to do with ecology and peace, the kind of ideas that Dr. Ehrlich is talking about. And I think that one of the most important things is it would actually get a lot of people involved with trying out certain things, setting certain personal patterns, like actually planting a tree and watching it grow, and actually not driving a car one day and thinking about what it amounts to. I'd like to have Dr. Ehrlich's comment on if he has one.
Well, yeah, I can give you a very easy comment, and that is I am totally in favor of anything and almost everything that will do anything to dramatize the problem, to bring home this kind of attitude to people. However, I think there is no substitute for putting the screws on the government. In other words, do all you can there, but for God's sake, get out after your congressman, because you've got to get where the power is, and that's where it is. Thank you very much.